So per the usual, I tracked down the rosters on Operation Sports, so thanks again to these guys for updating the rosters every year. My preferred game is 2K8 on the PS3. I know they're updating some of the rosters on 2K24, the NBA version. Hopefully at some point 2K will create a new college basketball game. But here you go. Yeah, updated rosters. Let's do this. I went ahead and simulated the play-in games. Ignore the seeding here. First we've got Howard versus Wagner. And these games are important because VCU made a run that one year. Howard with the victory. Colorado State versus Virginia. Colorado State. Grambling versus Montana State. Grambling with the victory. And finally, Colorado versus Boise State. And Boise State picks up the victory. Let's start in the East Regional with the overall number 1 seed UConn taking on the Stetson Hatters. And right off the jump, we've got an injury. Samson Johnson, their forward, is out with a broken toe, likely going to miss the entire tournament, so let's see how that plays out. But UConn picks up the victory nevertheless. Florida Atlantic and Northwestern. Florida Atlantic picking up the victory. San Diego State versus UAB. San Diego State with the victory. Auburn versus Yale in a 13-4 matchup. Auburn with the victory. BYU versus Duquesne. BYU with the victory, and Illinois versus Morehead State. Morehead State with a pretty big upset right there. Washington State versus Drake. This should be a good one. Drake with the victory. Iowa State versus South Dakota State. Iowa State with the victory. So on to the second round in the East. You've got Florida Atlantic versus UConn. UConn takes care of business. San Diego State versus Auburn. Auburn with the victory. BYU versus Morehead State. BYU pulling off the victory. Drake versus Iowa State. Iowa State. So in the Sweet 16 of the East, we have UConn versus Auburn. UConn pulls off the win. BYU versus Iowa State. BYU pulls off the upset. So in the Elite Eight of the East, we have UConn versus BYU. And UConn will be coming out of the East Regional and on to the Final Four. All right, let's head over to the West region. You've got Howard versus North Carolina, UNC with the victory, Michigan versus Mississippi State, Mississippi State, St. Mary's versus Grand Canyon. There's the 12-5 upset, Grand Canyon with the victory, Charleston versus Alabama, Alabama wins, Clemson versus New Mexico, Clemson, Baylor versus Colgate, Baylor, Dayton versus Nevada, Dayton with the win. Arizona versus Long Beach State. Arizona. So moving on to the second round, you've got North Carolina versus Mississippi State. Mississippi State pulls off the upset. Grand Canyon versus Alabama. Grand Canyon with a big upset. Clemson versus Baylor. Baylor moving on. And Dayton versus Arizona. Arizona. On to the Sweet 16. Grand Canyon versus Mississippi State. Mississippi State. Arizona versus Baylor. Arizona. So in the Elite Eight matchup, you have Mississippi State versus Arizona. Mississippi State moving on to the Final Four. All right, let's head over to the South region. You've got Houston as the number 1 seed here. They're going to be facing Longwood. Houston is going to take care of business. You've got Nebraska versus Texas A&M. Nebraska with the victory. Wisconsin versus JMU. Wisconsin wins. Duke versus Vermont. Duke. Texas Tech versus NC State. NC State with the victory. Kentucky versus Oakland. Kentucky. Florida versus Boise State. Florida. Not a lot of upsets here so far. Marquette versus Western Kentucky. Marquette. On to the second round. We've got Nebraska versus Houston, and Nebraska pulls off the big upset. Wisconsin versus Duke. Wisconsin. NC State versus Kentucky. Kentucky moving on. Florida versus Marquette. Florida with the victory. On to the Sweet 16. 2 Big Ten teams, Wisconsin versus Nebraska. Wisconsin getting the win. And Kentucky versus Florida. Kentucky. So in the Elite Eight, you have Wisconsin versus Kentucky. And Kentucky is moving on to the Final Four. On to the Midwest. Is Purdue going to beat a 16 seed? They're playing Grambling, and they do it. Utah State versus TCU, TCU. Gonzaga versus McNeese State pulls off the upset. Kansas versus Samford, Kansas. South Carolina versus Oregon, South Carolina moving on. Creighton versus Akron, Creighton with the victory. Texas versus Colorado State, Texas moving on. And Tennessee versus St. Peter's, Tennessee. No Cinderella this year for St. Peter's. On to the second round. Purdue versus TCU, TCU with the upset. McNeese State versus Kansas, McNeese State with the upset. Things are getting wild. South Carolina versus Creighton, Creighton with the victory there. Texas versus Tennessee, Texas pulls off the upset. So Sweet 16, McNeese State, TCU, TCU with the victory. And Creighton versus Texas, Texas. So you have an Elite Eight of TCU versus Texas. And TCU is going to the Final Four. Your Final Four is Kentucky TCU and UConn versus Mississippi State. UConn is going to beat Mississippi State to go to the national title game, and Kentucky versus TCU. Kentucky is going to move on, so your final matchup is UConn versus Kentucky, and UConn is your national champion.